Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. It is Tuesday, January the 17th, the first week of the new season, 2023, and we kick off the new season with oil prices, Brent sort of locked like a barnacle on a rock around mid-80s. It did have a surge up the first week of the year, a lot of optimism with the reopening of China, which has now taken a little bit of a pause. And is it any wonder that it does so when China announces that its population fell last year for the first time, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but the first time in 60 plus years, China's population has finally rolled over and is on the other side of the mountain and set to decline further. You'd say not any immediate reality for energy consumption, of course, but certainly for planning, and pile that in with everything else, the coming out of COVID, that explains why the oil markets are a little bit sober, despite the fact that there are literally hundreds of millions of people in China on the move today for the Lunar New Year. Let's welcome back our panelists. Let's kick off with Dr. Charles Elinas, who is the CEO of Cyprus Natural Hydrocarbons Company and the Senior Fellow at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Charles, have you missed your chance to dig a hole in the ground just off the coast there of Cyprus and get lots of gas out, as the Europeans are now drowning in LNG?
Probably we have. I mean, but the Europeans are drowning in LNG, but they are still telling the world that they don't need more gas after 2030. I mean, the gas utilization in Europe has already gone down by over 20% in comparison to 2021, and it's still going down.
Well, we said yesterday the CEO of Qatar Energy stating that he believes that Europe will go back to Russian gas.
That's exactly what he said. I'm not so sure about that. I think there is a consensus within Europe that at least in the foreseeable future, it's not going back to Russian gas. But this may be the lull before the storm. I mean, the CEO of Iberdrola warned that Europe is maybe too optimistic about the situation, that a harsh winter is still coming. I mean, there are now forecasts saying that by the end of the month, this month, we're going to have very low temperatures. So a harsh winter may still come. And the problems that will be faced in filling the storages with gas during the summer are getting more serious. For example, the Russian supply this year will be a lot less than last year, and if for any reason President Putin decides to reduce it even further, it will put Europe in difficulty. So it's still tricky. It's not that obvious which way it's going to go.
Let's welcome Andy Lavin, COO of Sahara Energy Resources. Andy, welcome back. Happy New Year. Really keen to get your kind of big picture view of where this year is going to go, given all of the emerging trends now 2 weeks into 2023.
Well, it's 2 weeks in is very difficult to predict the rest of the year with any certainty. But as I was saying before we started, I'm actually quite positive about the year. I think that we're seeing some little bumps on the road, but they weren't necessarily unexpected. China's population was expected to kind of go over the peak and start coming down. I think that what we've seen in the last quarter of 2022 is people recognizing that actually there are more sources of energy. And I think this year it's going to be a question of demand is the big issue, not supply. So supply is there, it's about demand. And I honestly do believe that actually the world is starting to right itself, getting to understand what having some of the commodities off the table because they're from Russia means for people, where they can get alternative supplies for, how they can do it, what they need to invest in. So I'm actually quite bullish in terms of the demand going through the rest of the year.
Omar Al-Obeidly, Director of Research, Bahrain Center for Strategic, International and Energy Studies. Kumbaya, Omar. Everybody just wants to dance the jig and take the shoes off and run on the beach. It seems, all of this talk of global recession, that Pakistan may default, that Sri Lanka is going off the cliff, etc., is just not to be paid attention to, and that all is well. Your thoughts on this sort of optimistic glow on the new year?
I'm not so optimistic, unfortunately. First of all, you've got a large number of Russian troops amassing, I think, on the Ukraine border, and I think we're going to get something quite unpleasant underway sometime in the next few weeks. Who knows when? I'm not a military expert, but I expect that conflict to get particularly ugly in the coming period, with significant adverse consequences for this wave of optimism. I'm not particularly optimistic about the US, either on the foreign policy front or on the domestic economic front. I think one of the articles you shared this morning in the brief was about the debt ceiling, which the US continues to have to extend, and the internal strife in the US domestic political scene is going to continue. I'm also, unfortunately, negative about the consequences of the either failure or potential success, either way, of the nuclear deal with Iran. I think the negotiations are going to, come to a conclusion sometime soon. And when that happens, I fully expect a wave of destabilizing activity to be initiated in the region by Iran as it seeks to, throw its weight around. And I expect Israel to, respond with an escalation on the military front. So I'm nowhere near as positive as my colleagues, but maybe it's the cold weather here in Bahrain. We've reached 14 degrees Celsius this week. It's freezing.
We have to take a moment to feel for the billionaires, because apparently the access fee to get into Davos this year was quadrupled from a measly $70,000 a ticket to $280,000 a ticket to access Davos. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling, and at the same token, very, very scary, because we have seen a number of reports coming out about the sort of gap in terms of the share of wealth created last year was the biggest ever, in itself potentially a black swan. But Dr. Charles, I saw, and I had to ask myself, on the agenda for Davos was the energy crisis. And my immediate reaction was, what energy crisis? We start the new year with that sense of Europe's energy crisis and its ramifications for the whole world, but ultimately that is behind us. We look at the gas price now, it looks sort of yawn sober, back to 21 levels. Oil is stuck in low 80s.
Well, certainly the markets believe that the crisis is over, and share prices in Europe are going up day after day now, since the beginning of the year. I'm not so sure about that. I think, as I said before, this is the lull. This could be the lull before the storm.
What would be the storm?
The harsh winter is coming, and there could be an escalation in Ukraine that complicates things even further. Europe is optimistic as always, but it may be faced with problems later in the year. The good thing, though, is that recession doesn't seem to be escalating as much as it was expected. So even though there is some recession in parts of Europe, it's not expected to go out of hand. So that's why there is additional added optimism that things will go well for the rest of the year. But I believe the next winter will be a little bit more difficult, harsher. I don't think gas prices will stay down to these levels for too long. I think they will go up to the extent that maybe much later in the year, the price cap on gas may come into effect. If you remember, it was about 180 euros per megawatt hour. That may come into effect by later in the year, and then we will see the consequences of that. The problem for Europe also is that China's economy is expected to grow much more than 5%. Some say much more than 5%, and Asia is coming out of COVID. The economies are going up, so gas utilization in Asia will go up, and Europe is going to find it that much more difficult to get more gas, especially since US LNG is not growing anymore. It has reached a plateau and is not growing. And if a lot of that US LNG is diverted to Asia, to China and Asia, then Europe may find itself in some difficulties later in the year. In addition to that, European industry, especially German industry, is still suffering massively. These prices are still high, and factories are closing, relocating to the Middle East and the United States. So it may be superficially optimistic at the beginning of the year, but I don't think we're out of the woods.
Andy, the point ultimately in terms of leaving some of these 2022 legacies behind us, the European energy crisis possibly in the back rear view mirror for now, at least, as Charles says, it could pop up next winter. But oil, the big sort of expectation for our 2022 was Russian oil would be disrupted. And again, it didn't happen mostly through the year. And then now with the EU embargo and with the G7 price cap, it was going to be disrupted. And the data showing for the month of December that Russian oil actually possibly had its highest month of exports in December. So looking to the year ahead, Russian oil disruption again forecast to come next month with the embargo on Russian diesel and Russian products. Your outlook for that, and again, this one day this Russian oil disruption will arrive.
So I think what the energy markets have demonstrated is their capacity to change with however the world needs to have it, wherever it is. So I think the important thing in terms of Russia is that you've kind of got the two adversaries, let's say. You've got Europe and you've got Russia, NATO, West, however you want to say it. The reality is that there is a portion of the globe which is going to push back heavily on Russia, especially if Omar says that something nasty starts to happen. But unfortunately, the world is not one world. I think Russia has found and will continue to find outlets for its crude, its products, its gas in different locations. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's going to be as efficient or as effective, because it's pushing things one way, and it probably is less effective in terms of what it's getting in terms of prices as it would have been had it not invaded. So everywhere is going to find an outlet, and you would have thought that the world would have learned from the lessons with Iran that it's impossible to totally cut off a country from the rest of the world. There's always going to be a way. And Russia is so much bigger than Iran. It has so many more customers that it's actually easier for them.
There's a certain narrative, Andy, that Russian diesel with the Europeans will be turning away, will find it difficult to find a new home because of the obvious challenge of compatibility.
At the end of the day, it's all about price and it's all about money, right? So at the end of the day, Russia could pump some of their money and change their refineries, change their specs. People can process, people can blend. You know, if Russia wants to give away a VLCC of gas oil, there will be people falling over themselves to take it. So it's all about price. So it will find a home no matter what. It just won't be the places that historically it's gone. So it's all about how the balance of flows changes over time. And that's why, to me, I do think, absent some of the really bad things that could happen, 2023 has to look better because you can start to see things opening up. Finally, China's opened up. Yes, their population's dropping, but that's not going to make a big difference. It's more the fact they're opening up, the fact that at some point in the future, they will start traveling again. So it's the demand side, which actually, to me, is far more important than any of the negatives that are sitting out there. And there are some negatives, don't get me wrong. I think Ukraine could become a very, very messy scenario.
Omar, more closer to home. I mean, when you think of the kind of outlook for the year ahead, we all seem to be forgetting that Iran is in some moment of incredible duress, and at the same token, it's moving by day closer to the capabilities. According to the U.S. Security and Foreign Ministry, it is literally days, weeks away from having nuclear weapon capability. How is this circle being squared in this current climate? What is the outlook for that moment in terms of the year ahead?
Well, first of all, I think that the nuclear capability of Iran is a bit of a red herring. The threat that Iran poses to its neighbors and to US interests comes in the form of the drones and the missiles. The nuclear, nobody expects Iran to bomb anyone, nor is anybody threatening to invade Iran. So I don't think the nuclear is the support as the reason. And it's, as I say, you've seen all the major.
Yeah, but Omar, ultimately the point is, whether you think it or not, both Israel and the United States government has declared that they will not accept a nuclear weaponed Iran. So that's a circle that has to be squared in some way.
This wouldn't be the first time or the last time that politicians draw a red line and then just get their pants pulled down. I think it's quite clear that neither country has the ability to do any significant damage to a nuclear. But I also think Iran is probably not dumb enough to get to the actual physical production. Because all they have to do is get to some, stage prior to it. But they will focus when it comes to making demands of other countries in the region. They will focus on the threat posed by their missile technologies and by their drone, and they will extract significant concessions. And there will be a period of destabilization. I was at a conference in Israel at the beginning of September, and the language coming out of policymakers in Israel is very escalatory. It's not, they're not looking to de-escalate and form a dialogue. So just as Ukraine is currently highly inflamed and things potentially could get worse, I have a very negative outlook for the security situation in the Middle East, and it's not helped by the fraying relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia, which is making question marks. And it's definitely not helped by a hardline government being elected in Israel, which has, not the greatest relations with the US either. So I'm afraid 2023 could see a significant escalation in our region of the world, in addition to the significant escalation in Eastern Europe. But luckily, Sean will be paying $208,000 to get residing in Davos and enjoying.
That's
the nice
only
weather.
for 5 days, I'm afraid. If you want to reside there any longer, you might have to mortgage the whole of Bahrain. Dr. Charles, the other sort of emerging narrative for the start of the year is the idea of where does Erdogan go vis-a-vis all of these emerging crises in Europe and Central Asia, and particularly can Putin and Erdogan choreograph some new gas corridor through Turkey into Central Asia? Your thoughts of that and the role of Turkey going forward as the sort of energy conduit, the alternative that may emerge?
Well, it's definitely going in that direction. Erdogan's polls are going up these days in Turkey. The opposition is fragmented. His position is strengthening, and he may call the elections in May, and it looks as if he's going to return. So he has been very successful so far, and people expect him to come back again in May. His relationship with Russia is mushrooming. As you probably know, Russia offered to make Turkey a hub for gas to Europe, and Erdogan is quite serious in taking up the offer, and now wants to discuss it and do something about it, as well as a hub with Asia. But the Erdogan's Achilles heel is his economy. His economy is in tatters. He's in great difficulties.
But if he gets re-elected, does he care?
Yeah, but rescuing the economy, maybe not. Maybe he won't care very much later on. But rescuing the economy, which at some stage he will have to, depends greatly on cooperation from Europe and the United States, not Russia. So there is a factor in there somewhere that to balance this, and it remains to be seen which way he's going to pull. I think, given that Turkey's longer-term future lies with Europe and with the United States, I'm not so sure that all of these words that come out about Russia and gas and all of these things will go too far.
Where does his the likelihood that he now is going to get re-elected, does that have any bearing, or how would that impact his decision in permitting signing off on Sweden and Finland joining NATO? Does it have a impact on that?
I think it will have an impact. I think, as I said before, Erdogan, at the end of the day, Erdogan also said that this will be his last stint at the presidency. And he has made his money. He wants to leave a legacy behind. He doesn't want to leave Turkey in 5 years in a mess. He wants to do something to bring Turkey back on growth. And that's his legacy. So I suspect that he's going to cooperate with the US and Europe more after the elections to rescue the economy. And that also includes NATO and cooperating with NATO. I think that is bound to happen after the elections in May.
Let's get the survey question, which is again about to China. And I want to get all of you guys to sort of give us your thoughts of where China goes this year. China's population fell last year for the first time in 6 decades, which we noted at the beginning of our half hour together. My question is, has China already reached peak oil demand, which is still currently almost 2 million barrels a day below the 215 to 219 level, which was above 15 million barrels a day pre-COVID. China had reached 15.2, 15.5, and now is still stuck in the 13s. But the question is, has it reached peak oil demand, give or take a few 100,000 barrels? But where does China's recovery go when it comes to oil consumption? The most optimistic outlook for the year ahead I've seen is 1 million barrels, which would bring it up into the 14 plus category. But to get to 15 plus, you'd really have to be looking out a few years of significant recovery. So I want to get the view of the room and also then get the view of the panelists on this idea. How big a deal is China and the reopening this year? Obviously, it's been the biggest story, I suppose, of the start of the year in terms of the trends, all else being equal, peak inflation, peak rates, European energy crisis behind us. China reopening is the question mark. How quick will it be, and when will it start to really impact global economics and global consumption, and also obviously Chinese oil consumption?
So I think it, to a certain extent, depends upon where those Chinese are going to travel and how quickly they can get their manufacturing back up and running at 100%. I actually looked at ChatGPT. So ChatGPT basically is in the world that probably it's hit the peak. I actually don't think it has. And the reason I would give in that is that if you look at the GDP per capita, there's a lot of people in China who actually don't use a lot of energy. Okay, so you'll see a shift in their use of energy. Now, to counter that, China is moving to cleaner fuels, it is moving to alternative energy, but nevertheless, when you've got people who've got very low energy usage, the easiest way to use energy is to burn oil and gas. So I think—
Or coal.
Or coal, exactly. So for me, in the next few years, I would expect China to continue to grow in terms of their production, and in terms of their domestic production, in terms of manufacturing, and therefore they'll start to use more energy, and that will be predominantly oil and gas. Once you get over the next 4 to 5 years, that's when I think the clean energy stuff is going to start kicking in the major cities, and also then moving out into the countryside. So I don't think we're at peak oil and gas demand yet for China, but it's coming. But it's coming in the rest of the world as well. So it's just a question of how quickly do we get there. I think, how quickly does China demand grow? I think the world was surprised at how quickly they opened back up again from their zero COVID. I actually think there's going to be significant pressure domestically to really open up and allow people to get out and do their business. I think, bizarrely, the World Cup probably kicked it all off, because there was commentary about, is Qatar in a different world than China? Because you had full stadiums with people without masks playing football in the streets, and then you've got a zero COVID policy in China. So I think we'll see them probably open up and much quicker than we're expecting.
Omar, your thoughts on the outlook for China? And I just want to pick up on that point that Andy touched on there, that China, what triggered these reopening? Obviously, what he didn't mention was the protests in November, and a number. I mean, we have Xi obviously being re-elected in October, the protests in November, and now the rapid abandonment of the zero COVID, the rapid abandonment of the clampdown on the big tech giants and the billionaires, and so on. That there's been a very sudden shift and some warmer tones towards the US. The G20 meeting in Indonesia was a bit of a love-in, except for the bargee with the Canadians. But ultimately, it seemed a number of things kind of shifted. Your thoughts on that and the outlook for China in this year?
So first of all, regarding the claim that this is Erdogan's last stint that Dr. Charles made, I'll believe that when I see it. But yes, going back to the point you made, I agree with all the factors. The key factors was, as you said, there was the re-election of Xi. I think probably is the most important one, along with the protests. Once he'd, put that house in order, because the zero COVID policy was very much tied to his personal legitimacy, and if that was going to be threatened during an election time, that's something which was unacceptable to him. Once he'd sorted that out, secured his premiership, then he could afford to be a bit more flexible with his domestic policies, including the COVID one, and respond. And at the end of the day, even though there's a lot of authoritarianism in China, there is definitely a sensitivity of the government to people's demands, however they are articulated. And there is a genuine fear that protests can get out of hand. So the protests absolutely had a major role to play. I also completely agree with Andrew regarding the source of increased demand. There's a lot of Chinese people who are still poor, and China is still growing. You know, you mentioned the population decline. One of the major reasons that China has been investing so heavily in artificial intelligence is because it realizes it's going to have a lot of old people around, and it wants, you know, robots to take care of them and robots to do the work that those people were doing when they left the workforce. And this is going to be a source of growth. I mentioned you asked ChatGPT a question. You've seen, I think some of us have seen how clever ChatGPT is. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we may see, you know, a significant productivity boost coming from these kind of artificial intelligence technologies in the same way that we saw the internet and computers doing in the 80s and 90s, and in the same way that we saw previous generations.
Which you'd have to think is bearish for oil consumption, right? From the point of view of, at least from the China point of view.
Well, I mean, first of all, China is, if it's taking its climate commitment seriously, then it's got to cut back on its coal. Burning coal is like the big, you know, and it's been burning coal willy-nilly, I think, for the last year. So I think there's still room for a big decrease in coal consumption and maybe some degree of switching to oil. And then secondly, you know, oil demand, I think with the electrical cars growth has been, the growth of electrical cars has been exaggerated because people are now hitting into supply constraints on the inputs into electric cars, on infrastructure for charging and so on and so forth. In the UK, so I think that demand for internal combustion engines is not going to fall off as quickly as has been anticipated in the past.
Let's give Charles the last word with the survey result. No, a whopping no in this room that we've reached peak oil demand. Charles, your outlook for China this year, there was as part of the year beginning narrative that China's reopening would be a big demand for LNG and sort of put the squeeze on Europe. But early signs are that China's still diverting cargoes to Europe because they're overflowing with gas themselves.
Well, they are at the moment, but the Chinese economy is coming out. I mean, a lot of the forecasts are very bullish about China. And apart from the other factors that Andrew and Omar referred to, living standards in China are still going up and still have a long way to go. And even if population growth is not going to be there anymore, the growth in living standards is going to carry on. That alone is going to drive oil demand and energy demand into the future. And I agree with Andrew, the peaking oil demand in China, like the rest of the world, is down the line. It still has a few years to go. With living standards going up, aviation, the need for aviation fuel is going to go up as well dramatically, with a lot more Chinese traveling than before. So I still believe that China is coming out of it, and it will come out of it well by the end of the year. President Xi seems to be determined to make it happen. He has consolidated power. He has improved his links with the Arab world, securing his supplies. And I think he is planning for quite a substantial growth. I mean, the austerity period of last year is behind China. It's going, from now on, it will carry on going forward.
Well, the other part of that equation, which we won't have time to get into now, is what its bearing for inflation will be if indeed China does go back roaring on all cylinders and consuming all of the commodities it can get its hands on. Will that drive inflation back to the top of the agenda? There's counter argument to that is the fact that China reopening on all fronts will ease all of the congestion in the supply chain that has contributed greatly to the inflation surge of recent years. And with that supply chain easing, the counterbalance on inflation will be made up for whatever comes from the energy side. So that's one argument. Anyway, that's enough to be getting on with. It's $84 and change on Brent this morning. Omar Obeidly, thank you so much for your time. Andrew Levin and Charles Elinas, happy New Year to you all and look forward to your contributions through the year. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you and Happy New Year, Sean.